Thanks, Tim.
Hi, I'm Joe Cortright, and I work with CEOs for Cities, which is a national organization of urban leaders based out of Chicago, and deals really with a whole set of issues having to do with the economic competitiveness, economic contributions of cities, and has increasingly paid a lot of attention to quality of life, and in particular thought about the role that transportation plays in influencing the success of cities. And we're very much a metrics-driven organization, and you can visit our website and see a number of things we've done, including a study called City Vitals, which outlines a set of indicators that we think are good at understanding what drives urban vitality. And we, like others, have been longtime readers of the Texas Transportation Institute's Urban Mobility Report, which is de facto the most widely used, I think it's fair to say, measure of the performance of urban transportation systems. And as we looked at that report, I think we were troubled with some of the implications of the findings that were in that report. And as a result, we're led to take a much closer look at the report and its methodologies. And before I get into the detail, I want to thank Tim, because they have done a good job historically of putting their report on their web. Their findings, their detail, their methodology has been there for people to look at if they chose to. And I know that, as Tim says, their objective has been really to perform a public information role. But what I want to highlight are some concerns that we have based on the way that the report has been spelled out. And what I want to suggest to you in simplest terms is that as a guide to understanding the problems of our urban transportation systems and what to do about them, the Urban Mobility Report is a broken compass. It points us in the wrong direction. And I'll try and outline why I think that is in terms of what we think some of the conceptual problems are with the measures that it uses, some problems with the data that we found, and then conclude by talking about how we need to augment the way that we measure urban transportation to get a fair and accurate and I think helpful picture of what we need to do. And I hope this is the beginning of a dialogue rather than the end of a discussion about the best ways to come up with good measures for urban transportation systems. Let me briefly summarize some of the claims that are made in the Urban Mobility Report. It basically argues that congestion is a big problem. With the exception of the last couple of years, it's grown steadily worse over the last few decades that they've been doing the report, that it wastes a lot of energy and it costs us a lot of money. These are the numbers from the 2007 report. The 2010 report, which came out in January of this year, says congestion is a little bit less bad than they thought it was earlier. Although now, even though the number of hours of delay has gone down, the cost is now estimated to be somewhat higher. I don't know if that's just inflation, but they're saying it's really bad. This claim, or the set of claims that are in the UMR, it gets wide distribution. It gets uncritical repetition in the media everywhere. It is a ready-made story for TV and news outlets. My hat's off to you guys there, Tim. You do a fine job of getting a lot of media interest in this. And they pick up the findings from the worst cities here, Washington and Chicago, by Tim's lights, that spend 70 hours a year idling in traffic. And I think really what this is more, though, than shedding light on the issue. What it does do is generate heat, because it doesn't necessarily tell us what's causing this problem, and it doesn't tell us what to do about it. But it is used in a very particular way in political discourse. It is used to say that we need to spend more money on transportation capacity. And I know Tim is more nuanced than that. I know he has broader views. I know he thinks there are a variety of policy approaches to responding to this grievous crisis that you see documented here. But in fact, even Tim lapses into the jargon that is generated by the Urban Mobility Report, which is, you need to build more capacity, quoted twice in an article in the Washington Post when it came out. So, irrespective of, I know, Tim's intellectual nuance here, the way this report gets used is to beat the drum about spending more money on more capacity everywhere. And I think that's fundamentally not a helpful message, because it doesn't really tell us what the nature of the problems are, or really what we can do about them. let me focus on a key concept on which the Urban Mobility Report is based, something called the Travel Time Index. And it's the way they measure the extent of congestion in each of the large metropolitan areas in the United States. And the TTI is simply a ratio measure of the amount of time it would take at free flow traffic speeds compared to the amount of time it actually takes in congested conditions. So if you had a typical commute trip of something like 25 or 20 minutes in uncongested period, and that same trip on average took 25 minutes during the peak hour, then you would regard that as a travel time index of 1.25, which is just the ratio of those two measures. And that would be, in some respects, a useful measure for grading cities and how well their transportation systems work. But for the fact that trips and the distance of trips varies substantially, not just across neighborhoods, as we heard in the previous panel, not just across people, but across metropolitan areas. And so it's not a reasonable basis for making comparisons, at least by itself. So let me give you an example of two cities. One that the Urban Mobility Report says is doing very badly, and another one that says it's doing pretty well. Those are Charlotte and Chicago, which just happen to be adjacent to one another alphabetically, which is why we picked them. The travel time index for Chicago is 1.43, which is among the highest. The travel time index for Charlotte is 1.25, which is about average, maybe a little bit below average. The commuters in the two places actually face exactly the same number of minutes of delay, according to the Urban Mobility Report, just slightly less than 10 minutes. But the folks in Charlotte, as it turns out, as you can see from the numbers here, spend about 16 minutes per day, per person, every day, every commuting day, every year, traveling in peak hour traffic because they travel almost 50% further. And that is not a set of factors that is reflected in the Urban Mobility Report as it's presented and described. So cities that have really compact development patterns, even if they have the same number of minutes of delay, are portrayed as having a far worse problem by the Travel Time Index. In essence, the Travel Time Index, as it's structured, penalizes compact cities. Because if you hold everything else constant and increase the average trip length that people take, that improves your travel time index score. Now that matters, as I said, because travel distances vary substantially among cities in the United States. When you look at the broad average of the Urban Mobility Report and sort of back out how much time it says we're spending in peak hour traffic, the typical resident of a large metropolitan area in the United States spends about 200 hours a year in peak hour travel. But in the best performing cities, travelers travel about 40 hours per year less than that. And in the worst performing, they travel about 40 hours more. So you obviously want to know which are the cities that have the least total travel time in peak hour compared to the ones that don't. And it turns out the ones that are the best performers uniformly are the most compact metropolitan areas. And I have copies of our full report driven apart here. It's the green document in the front that's spilled all over the front. But this chart shows you, for each of the 50 large metropolitan areas in the United States, the total amount of travel time in peak hour periods by metropolitan area. And you can see at the top are these sprawling, newer developed metropolitan areas, Nashville, Oklahoma City, Birmingham, Richmond, where people are spending 240 hours a year or more in peak hour traffic. And at the bottom of the list are older, more compact metropolitan areas. Chicago was the lowest, New Orleans, Milwaukee, Sacramento, Cleveland, New York, where shorter travel distances enable people to spend less time traveling. And the difference that's attributable to the longer trips is shown as the shaded amount in each bar. And it turns out that as a cost, a time cost for Americans, is cumulatively bigger than the delay estimates that are presented in the Urban Mobility Report. Now, in the earlier panel, you heard a lot about robustness. And one of the questions that we had about the Urban Mobility Report is, are the findings about this worsening congestion problem robust, in the sense that can you verify them with other sources of data? So we looked around at a couple of different sources of data. The key claim of the Urban Mobility Report is the total amount of peak hour travel time, the peak hour delay, has more than doubled since 1980. And if that were true, you would expect the average commuting trip of the average American to get longer because they're spending more time in delay. But it turns out when you control for changes in trip distances, there's actually been no increase in travel time over the 20-year period, and we compared the Urban Mobility Report for the same years that the National Household Transportation Survey was done. So it turns out that you can't corroborate this claim that it's much worse than it was 20 years ago by looking either at the Household Transportation Survey data or by looking at the pattern of changes across metropolitan areas. You would expect that if they got the model right, that they're able to predict the increasing delays should result in increasing commuting times for people by metropolitan area. Turns out, and we've spelled this out in the study, there's very little correlation between their estimate of how much worse delay got and whether people are actually traveling greater amounts of time in each metropolitan area. And then, as Tim mentioned, they've recently partnered with INRIX, but it's interesting when you compare their previous report, the 2007 report, with the INRIX data for the same year. And INRIX estimated a travel time index using the same methodology, the same definitions that Tim uses, and every single metropolitan area, with the exception of New York City, the INRIX estimate of the travel time index for that city was much lower, or conversely, the UMR's estimate of the travel time index was on average, about 70% higher. So we're not sure we can corroborate it that way either. The other thing I want to talk about in terms of data is the supposed fuel efficiency costs attributable to congestion. And I think this is a really widely repeated, widely believed story, that we waste a lot of gasoline because we're idling in traffic. The previous studies, and I haven't seen the reference for how this was done in the latest study, but all the previous studies cited a study that was done by a gentleman named Rouse working for the Department of Transportation. It was done in 1981. Now this is a difficult study to get a hold of because it's not on the internet, or it wasn't when we did our study. We were only able to get it on microfiche. Fortunately, we had somebody with a microfiche reader. We found that the original Rouse study was done for 1970s era General Motors cars that averaged about 14 miles per gallon. And the calculations were done on an HP programmable calculator, just to give you an idea of sort of the vintage of this data. And the estimates that they did basically were only for fuel economy for vehicles traveling at city speeds, that is under 35 miles per hour. But the UMR's model extrapolated that result out to the full range of speeds. And essentially it implied that the faster you went, the more efficient your car became. And we know that's simply not true. And specifically, the study warned that the data was not valid for travel speeds of greater than 35 miles per hour. So we think that there are serious reasons to question the claim that there are big energy costs associated with congestion. In fact, a very good argument can be made that modest levels of congestion that slow traffic down from above 60 miles per hour or above 50 miles per hour down to about 45 miles per hour actually improve fuel economy because vehicles are more efficient at those somewhat lower speeds. But that needs to be netted out if we're going to understand the fuel economy effects. The other thing that I would note is, while the study tends to say that things are perpetually getting worse, it actually conceals the fact that some cities are doing much, much better than they were. If you take the Urban Mobility Report and look at its rating for the city of Portland, for the Portland metropolitan area, for 1982 and for 2007, it says basically that congestion got about 3 or 4 times worse over that period of time, as measured by the travel time index. Travel time index increased from 1.07 to 1.29. But if you look at the actual data about trips and trip lengths, it turns out that the average amount of time that people spent traveling in the peak hour actually declined by about 10 minutes, according to the numbers generated from the Urban Mobility Report. So things actually got better, and the reason is average trip lengths declined by about 3.5 miles per person per day. So again, compactness, if you can drive shorter distances, you get travel time savings. That's not reflected in the Urban Mobility Report the way it's done. And we haven't done the full analysis of the latest version of the UMR, but we've looked at some of the data in it, and we find the same kind of problems. And again, I'll just compare Portland, Oregon, Nashville, Tennessee. The Urban Mobility Report says that the TTI, the Travel Time Index, is worse in Portland than it is in Nashville. But folks in Nashville are spending about 75 hours more per year in peak traffic than are their counterparts in Portland, essentially because of sprawl in those areas. Now we think that it's time, given the improved information we have about transportation systems, the continuing importance of this as a policy issue, to think about developing a set of measures that is better, that is more broadly reflective of the way our transportation systems work. And we have a set of criteria that we spell out in our report for what we think those measures should have. We think they need to talk about access to destinations. It's not just about travel time. It has to do with what can we reach. Transportation is not an end in itself. It's a means of achieving other objectives, and we need to have measures that reflect that. We need to explicitly put land use and trip distance into our formulas. We need to incorporate better data, not just INRIX, but there are a multiplicity of other sources that we can use. As much as Tim and I know I am are proud of the work that we've done, I think this is a subject that merits a much broader debate. It's not something that should be in the hands of any one researcher. It should be an open source process, a community-owned process where there can be a lot of debate, a lot of deliberation, a lot of testing of the various approaches. And that would definitely improve things. And I think ultimately the aim here has to be not just to beat the drum about how awful congestion is or how awful it seems, but to provide policymakers with a reasonable basis for understanding the nature of the problems that are being caused and what we can do about them. And I think, unfortunately, as the Urban Mobility Report stands right now, it doesn't help policymakers do that. In conclusion, I think the key message of our research is that it isn't capacity expansion that is really the key here. It's the way we build our communities. And if we want to lessen the amount of time that Americans have to spend in peak hour traffic and incurring the time and energy bills that are associated with that, we should focus more on how we build our cities than how we build our roads. And we ought to have a set of measures that helps us understand that problem going forward. Thanks very much.